Hello everyone, today we talk about the 395 BC Battle of Daskylion between the Spartans and the Persians, the local Persian satrap. And this is actually a small engagement at the time, and this encounter is actually a little more than a skirmish in practice, so we had no bigger strategical or political importance, but it's still very interesting from a tactical point of view, which is the reason why we discuss it today. Essentially, it was a battle fought by 700 Spartan hoplites and 400 Persian cavalry, including two war chariots. So first of all, what makes it interesting is even this purely infantry versus cavalry battle, which is rare indeed, because at this time, these armies were already, especially the Persians, traditionally were really multi-arm in their armies. The Greeks were slowly evolving from their classical hoplitic phalanx into the usage of other more flexible troops, usually mercenaries and all. But this one therefore is something quite interesting, and secondly it's important also for the outcome, in the sense that the Persian cavalry basically defeated the Greek phalanx at this time, but we will see under which condition, and it's definitely fascinating to discuss. Relatively to the... Wait a second, I close a bit of windows that shouldn't be opened. Yeah. Relatively to the commanders here, the Spartan commander was Agesilaus II, a Uri-Pontic king of Sparta. That was considered, quoting Plutarch, as good as tough commander and king of all Greece. Here we are actually at the end, after the we're in the period of Spartan hegemony, after the Peloponnese War, and it's a very particular moment in classical history, still classical, not yet Hellenistic, but it's also a moment of transition from, let's say, hoplitic classical hoplitic warfare had basically developed all in the Greece into the Hellenic motherland, because of particular politics, society, terrain. Therefore, it had been traditionally quite a ritual and a quite ritualized and seasonal warfare that had shaped this particular tactics of the hoplitic phalanx. That is something that, in spite of what many people believe, was actually not spread outside the Greek motherland, in the sense that there were attempted copies of this, or better, maybe certain adaptations, especially relatively to the equipment and all, but without the proper Hellenic environment. Even in those phalanxes that were created into the Hellenic polis abroad had already a completely different social background, and therefore their military evolved in a completely different way. In practice, many people also believe that, I don't know, the Romans adopted the hoplitic, classical hoplitic phalanx, and it was a copy of that. Absolutely false. I know it's not a popular view. I know a lot of people absolutely disagree with this, but simply I think that they don't know what they're talking about, and historiographically speaking, this is at least today something pretty well known. Yet in popular culture, things have still to to be moved, and in my little I will try to do something for it. Although I just mentioned this topic now, but this is not what I want to talk about. What I wanted to say is that basically during and after the Peloponnese War, the classical hoplitic warfare basically evolved into something different, in the sense that the Greeks maintained their own phalanx, but they increasingly coupled it with other with other arms, usually mercenaries, lighter troops, cavalry, and all. So the whole thing eventually would have evolved into the Hellenistic warfare with other changes that I'm not going to detail of, but of which I won't go in detail. But I will definitely discuss this one day. And this battle of Daskylion is actually very interesting from this point of view, because it's been fought outside of the Greek motherland, and in this sense it presents certain characteristics that eventually caused the Spartan defeat in this case, and that made complexively the Greeks to rethink their way of warfare and getting towards something very progressively, because the Greeks were quite traditionalist in this sense. They had a great sense of superiority. They believed essentially their political model was meant as the one of the polis proper, like perfection, and therefore they didn't see even. The Spartans here are an exception in the sense that the Spartans, differently from the other Greeks, were the only ones who saw warfare as a professional business. But they're an exception that confirms the rule, and still, however, in spite of their higher training, order, and discipline, and tactical mobility that made them so effective against other Greeks, the essential of their warfare was essentially was the same of the other Greeks, and the phalanx in itself, as we will see, had certain weaknesses that could be exploited to be defeated. So from the other side, Daskylion is, I think, it's a place close to where the first of all, it laid in the Achaemenid satrapy of northwestern Anatolia, in practice, and it's in today's Turkey. By the way, the Battle of Granicus was fought eventually in 334 BC by Alexander the Great, exactly between Abydos and Daskylion. So these were battlefields that were kind of history repeated itself sometimes in this battlefield. I mean, not really history, but I mean there were areas that saw a lot of warfare, like many others, in spite of the fact that most of ancient warfare is unknown to us, and the Greeks were at this time the only ones who had the cultural means to basically to hand down these informations, for which we know of a small encounter such the one of the Daskylion, and that many others that in this sense were similar around the Aegean Sea, in battlefields that saw multiple clashes sometimes in different epochs. Also because geography basically obliges you to go into certain ways, and you end up usually finding yourself in the same strategical situation that others have been in the same place before you. So this was a moment of into which Sparta basically was trying to enter into the matters of the Achaemenid Empire because of the political instability of the empire, and the Spartans actually were allies with the Persians, but when they saw that things were going wrong, they obviously took advantage of, yes, the Spartans were allied with the Persians. I mean, there aren't just the Persian wars, there are also other engagements, and Sparta was backed by the Persian Empire at that point, and were allies. And at this time, therefore, the Spartans were basically intervening in Anatolia with the excuse of practically respond to the appeal of several Ionian Ionian Greek cities better, that dwelled into the Asian coast of the Aegean Sea, and that were under the Achaemenid Empire. There were actually a lot of Greeks that inhabited the Achaemenid Empire, even communities that were very far away from the Aegean Sea, like in Afghanistan, like eventually where Bactria would have formed, and exactly because of this local Greek presence, there were a lot of Cretans, seemingly, that were actually quite happy of being under the Persians. When eventually Alexander came, they didn't want to be under him because apparently the Persians were more tolerant. So the Spartans at this point were kind of doing similar thing, coming there in the name of Greek liberty, to save these Ionian cities from the yoke of the terrible Persian tyrant, but really trying to impose their own rule in turn on them. And eventually the Spartan intervention into the Persian Empire, tried by Agesilaus, failed, was aborted, especially after the defeated battle of Cnidus in 394 BC, so just 1 year after the events of Daskylion. And the local Ionian Greeks were actually pretty happy to hear this news, preferring the Persians to the Spartans. Although we must say that the Persian Empire was essentially very decentralized. First of all, because it was huge. So at the time there weren't so many ways to control a place, if not basically delegating someone to look into your place. And in fact, the Battle of the Daskylion was fought between Agesilaus and the Persian politician and aristocrat and soldier, we can say, Pharnazabas the second. He was son of Pharnaces II of Phrygia, and he had seemingly quite noble ancestors, and he basically ruled the satrapy of the Hellespontine Phrygia into Anatolia. So these satraps were local rulers in the name of the King of Kings, the great King of Persia. And this meant that they were actually drawn from local aristocracies that could be often intermarried with the imperial, better the royal family than the royal dynasty. So these were figures that had a sort of trust deriving first of all from the local prestige that they already had on the local base, and then from sort of cooptation carried out by the Central Persian rule. Pharnabazos definitely was fighting against the Spartan intervention in his lands. So this encounter occurred into this fashion. Now we will be using the only source that I think tells about this battle, that is Xenophon, and especially his Hellenica, that are I think Xenophon doesn't really need an introduction. He was one of the most famous historians and soldiers, and as well as a philosopher, mercenary. He was also a pupil of Socrates. He's mostly famous for his achievements in the so-called Anabasis, of the 10,000 that he came to command, and we know actually a lot about Greek warfare of the time. I mean, we can draw a freaking lot of information from there about Greek warfare at the time, and he had a direct experience, so he is kind of reliable in many ways. It's very interesting. We will be talking about him again and again. And in the Hellenica, that is how I believe in ancient Greek it was originally pronounced. Today we use the Latin, the Latinization, that is the Hellenica, essentially. He describes practically the I mean, this work is a sort of thematic continuation of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. So he starts telling from the point to which Thucydides had stopped. Hellenica simply means a writing on the Hellenic subjects in practice, it tells also a lot of other informations, not just about that, but it's mostly really relatively also to the Peloponnesian War. There is also a lot about its aftermath and all. And the Battle of Daskylion is really told by Xenophon, and I think it's really coming to the battle. It's really worth to simply read from Xenophon. Hellenica, it should be for I don't know whether 15 and 19, but yeah, I should find it. Sorry, what a second. Yes, and okay. So I simply read. So Agesilaus, who had not failed to note the king's impatience. The kings here, it's really about the Persians, as where he is approaching essentially Pharnabazus troops. So who had not failed to note the king's impatience, at once fitted out a ship of war and gave orders to Callias, a Lacedaemonian, to escort the maiden to her new home. After which, this is all a story itself before, but I'm really talking about reading the whole paragraph. Here, and after which he himself began his march on the Daskylion. Here was the palace of Pharnabazus. It lay in the midst of abundant supplies. Here too were most fair hunting grounds, offering the hunter choice between enclosed parks and a wide expanse of field and fell. And all around there flowed a river full of fish of every sort, and for the sportsman versed in fowling, winged game in abundance. Now it's interesting here because it tells how the Persians were and the Persianized aristocracies were keen on hunting, which was typical, which is something the Greeks usually didn't do as such. I mean, the average Greek wanted just to dwell into the polis, and he might have been a peasant citizen, but hunting in this sense to these huge estates was something that just noble could do, and the Greeks were fiercely against nobles in practice, although here we must say that Xenophon is particularly sympathetic of oligarchic regimes. He really looks favorably towards the Spartans, that in this sense were a bit less democratic at this point than other Greeks, and he also kind of he was well acquainted with Persian culture, as we know, So here it's giving a good description that is interesting also in military terms, because we know that Persian ability was quite well versed into hunting, also for military training reasons. So they knew how to shoot a bow, they knew how to use lance, javelins and all. And the favorite activity for doing that was hunting, that was done on horseback and all, and this is something that eventually also that the Persian culture played on Hellenism and even on the Byzantine Empire and all. I mean, these models of the great king that, I don't know, kills lions and other fierce animals and all. This is something that passed through eventually through Alexander, through the successors and all. It was part also of the monarchic models of and this was actually the previous paragraph. Now we get to the Battle of Daskylion proper. So he basically, Agesilaus was marching here to this very wealthy land. So here it says that there were abundant supplies, which is always a concern in logistical terms. And in these quarters, the Spartan king passed the winter, collecting supplies for the army, in fact, either on the spot or by a system of forage. So this could happen both at distance or locally with different means. And one of these occasions, this is important, the troops, who had grown reckless and scornful of the enemy through a long immunity from attack, whilst engaged in collecting supplies, were scattered over the flat country, when Pharnabazus fell upon them, with 2 Scythe-Chariots and about 400 horse. Seeing him thus advancing, the Alanes ran together, mustering possibly 700 men. The Persians did not hesitate, but placing his chariots in front, supported by himself and the cavalry, he gave the command to charge. The Scythe-Chariots charged and scattered the compact mass, and speedily the cavalry had laid low in the dust about 100 men, while the rest retreated hastily under cover of Agesilaus and his hoplites, who were fortunately near. So this is very interesting, and it basically tells it all the way we know it. Essentially, here it was a pretty normal situation. There are many occasions into military history, also other very famous passages. I think about the Bello Gallico and Caesar and his legionnaires in Britain, when they were foraging and they see the British chariots and cavalry approaching, and all. I mean, the foraging was definitely, as we know, an obvious logistical need, and a lot of time and thought had to be taken indeed in order to feed the army in this fashion. So here the Greeks basically were dwelling into this area during the winter. So it was also a moment into which usually military activity was decreasing for environmental reasons, in the northern hemisphere at least. Here it says it explicitly that basically the troops that were the troops were sent to forage, and they had grown reckless and scornful of the enemy through long immunity from attack. So they basically, this is also normal thing psychologically speaking. The enemy is, you don't see him anymore. You say, well, there is some danger, but hey, we haven't seen him anymore. And war is all a bit in this way, a lot of waiting, a lot of trying to understand what the enemy's gonna do next, always spying on the enemy. Obviously here Pharnabazus definitely had scouts, or someone who was checking that out, what the Greeks were doing. So we don't know actually even up to which point Pharnabazus actually had planned maybe this thing, but he simply found these Spartans were collecting supplies scattered over the flat country. So even the battleground here that is pretty well suited for cavalry was flat, was planned. Actually, also the phalanx works well into a flat country, but it usually deploys into places in which it cannot be surrounded in practice. You see that in many battles. I don't know, the most emblematic is obviously the one of the Thermopylae, into which that was actually a mountain pass, so that they were placing into, you know, the greatest strength of the phalanx was the front solidity in practice, and the Persians had troubles, as we know, breaking down the Greeks frontally. But a flat country in here also means that it was an open ground, so a place into which theoretically even a formation, even a phalanx well formed could have been actually exposed in the middle of nowhere in relatively to their flanks and all. We don't really know that, at least here it doesn't seem that there are other hints relatively to that. What we know in practice is that these guys were caught in complete disorder in an open ground. So that's the situation where cavalry says, okay, jackpot, and let's attack these guys while they're not into formation, because obviously the individual value is inferior to the one of the same individual into a formation, and that's the reason why there are formations and tactics, because they work in this fashion. Now Pharnabazus basically he was advancing. Here it says 2 Scythe-Chariots, which is interesting that there were only 2. Scythe-Chariots were really not a novelty at the time at all. Actually, this was a moment into ancient warfare into which war chariots were kind of falling into, had actually already fallen into decline. They were still useful because, you know, there were lots of things that might be very old or may outdated but still functioning. I mean, if you take an 18th century musket, well, it's gonna kill you. It doesn't matter whether it's outdated here in 2018. But it's the sheer, I mean, the whole concept of Scythe-Chariot that is, it's pretty impressive. It's it basically adds the cavalry charge effect that is already something devastating by itself. Here we have a representation. I don't know how much historical, but it's kind of how it had to be. To the idea that in the front or on the wheels, you have basically these blades, that can, you know, chop everything that they find in the middle, including legs, even entire people in two. Plus you have, as you see here, some guys on the chariot itself that can throw javelins and all, and this thing can maneuver, you know. Chariots can run amok also in practice, and there are countless examples into ancient military history, but you also have to deal with them in some fashion. Now, these Spartans only had hoplites. They simply didn't have skirmishers and all, so dealing with this chariot was quite problematic because chariots were had fallen into decline since much earlier than this, essentially for the presence into the new presence into ancient battlefields of more thick, solid, compact infantry formations that could withstand their charge. Even charging with these things into an hoplitic phalanx was pretty let's say it's not something very healthy to do for all involved, but especially for those who are in the chariot, because the horses practically do not charge into thickly compact masses of spearmen usually. They can occasionally, but they're not dumb, so they want to survive, and they will kind of stop in front of the enemy. So these chariots could be used as they were originally used, by the way, by skirmishing the enemy with javelins, with arrows and stuff like that. And then eventually, when the enemy ranks were enough softened up, maybe trying the proper charge. But it's not something that you tried in the sense, let's say if it breaks, you probably already see that the cohesion of the ranks is, if it is collapsing, you just charge into there, and even before you actually impact into the enemy, these are gonna already be fleeing. And this is really how cavalry charges are. I mean, it's not really about the physical impact, it's about the psychological one. And I can assure you that withstanding a cavalry charge is something psychologically devastating, and we have massive evidence of this, and sometimes it's just ridiculous, apparently for someone who has never thought about it, or thought at least to be in the situation, for how devastating a cavalry charge can be. But you can withstand that with good morale, esprit de corps, discipline, training. But it's not something easy. It's something extremely tough. Much more than seeing lots of infantry that charges against you. And here it's interesting that there were only two Scythe-Chariots that, as we will see, will have an actually good, a very key role into the outcome of the battle. Just for saying that these things, in spite of the actual anachronism, were still pretty effective, even in such small numbers. By the way, war chariots were usually also quite expensive in their own way. You needed someone who had to use them. It's quite complicated actually to make them work into formation. They can get disordered pretty easily, so I think that the major employment of these things was, well, actually in ancient warfare we have a pretty dynamic use of these chariots, but it also depends largely on which chariots we're talking about, because maybe the earliest ones were something relatively light, very agile. These Scythe-Chariots of the later stage seem to have been something a bit more robust, a bit more focused on the impact, and indeed conceived to break on tougher formations than one of the previous times. And therefore probably they were mainly used at this point in usually in a frontal attack like the one it's suggested now. Then there were other 400 horse. Now the Persian cavalry was usually pretty mixed. The Persian army was already quite mixed. It was quite multi-ethnic. It heavily relied on local levies, on local troops. So given the immensity of the empire, there was literally all the world into there. And as I know, Phrygia, so this area into which the whole thing is taking place, had pretty good horses, historically speaking, good cavalrymen. So These weren't probably the heavy cataphracts of the steppes at all. They were probably partially armored cavalry, but with a greater majority of lighter skirmishing cavalry, stuff like that. But still with some, obviously charging and capability and shock impact and all. So we don't. Here really it's all what we have, so we can just speculate in terms of relatively to the informations that we have. So at this point, what are the Persians doing? Essentially, they're advancing, so they're not at close range, because it says, seeing him that is Farnazabas advancing, the Hellenes ran together, mustering possibly 700 men. So this is very accurate, because what we know in how, psychologically speaking, how humans work on the battlefield is that they give strength to each other if they are close. So these guys eventually wanted to resist, also because they knew that fleeing individually would have been worse, in the sense that it could have been hunted down individually more easily, while regrouping and trying to oppose a solid formation to the Persians might have meant saving their own lives. So here it says they mustered 700 men. So the 700 men we were talking about before is just the sum, the part of a larger group that was foraging at this time. Here it says the Persian did not hesitate, but placing his chariots in the front, supported by himself and the cavalry, he gave the command to charge. So these Persians weren't approaching like out of the blue, like in an ambush. They were spotted. They gave time to these guys to the Greeks to regroup in practice. And here, given at least how it's as it's told by Xenophon, it seems like they were advancing not even in battle formation. So because it says that Pharnabazus placed his chariots in the front, so he basically stopped and deployed. He arrayed his troops in this fashion that they weren't previously. Supported by himself and the cavalry. Here I don't know what it really means, in the sense that it sounds like he here only cavalry is mentioned, but it says supported by himself and the cavalry. It suggests that there might have been maybe some other body that was under Pharnabazus himself, but usually this would have been mounted as well. Especially given the local military traditions that were quite based on great mobility, and there is no reason to believe that he had foot soldiers as well. But what it is important here the most, I believe, is that he says that the chariots were supported by cavalry, which implies I don't know, it can be theoretical in the sense that maybe, I don't know, first the chariots went and then the cavalry, but in my opinion probably there was some cavalry supporting actively at the same time the chariots. And he says that he gave command to charge. So it was a planned thing. Probably the Greeks in this sense had mustered in even in a location that wasn't just the first one of fortune. There is actually no other information about the kind of terrain that Greeks chose, nor whether if there were other obstacles or that could, I don't know, maybe cover their flanks, or having I don't know, a stream in the front. We don't really know. It's plausible that wherever they were, they probably made the best choice available in terms of ground. Recognizing the ground, it's something that in that age is pretty much all these guys were thinking about. There are some very interesting passages in Greek literature that tells it relatively exactly to the Persians, that while they went hunting, they kind of looked at, if the enemy came from that direction, what do I do? And also they exercised themselves in this way. So this is a kind of good. We have no other detail relatively to the actual solidity of the Greek formation. It sounds like the Persians had all the time in deploying, so they probably were confident in the way they I was reading once again. Well, here it says actually the Persians did not hesitate, so it suggests that they were trying to save time, not to let the Spartans regroup in practice. But it sounds like the whole deployment of cavalry was done pretty orderly. Relatively to the Spartans, we don't really know, in fact, at this point, how solid their array at that point really was. These guys were foraging, so they probably already were exercising their strength by this activity. They were relaxed. They were probably also, I don't know, they weren't so fit, so prepared to these events. So there was also psychological impact in seeing the Persians coming up. So they weren't probably in the best of the conditions to do that. Presumably to fight. Presumably they had brought definitely their weapons with them, because here eventually they engage into fight, so there is no reason to believe that even though they didn't expect the enemy, they were less prepared to meet them in terms of equipment. But let's say that there are many other small factors and details that probably, if these guys didn't expect the enemy to pop out and expect, they might have forgotten about. So probably this Spartan phalanx wasn't really at the fullest of its chances. This wasn't they weren't deployed in battle array. They didn't expect to fight. And this is important to consider basically what they were expecting, in the sense that when you march into battle, you also try to follow a kind of an order already in the march formation. If you are all scattered, probably you're gonna line up quite hastily, and that is actually quite negative for the solidity of the formation, because the formation is not just a bunch of guys put together into a geometrical form on a geometrical base. In order to have a functional formation, you have to have the same men who are trained for being to that formation in the same place, with the same guy in front of you, with the same officers placed, that know the men and on which one they can mostly rely. You have to be already framed into that fashion to be effective. So probably this wasn't really the case. This didn't mean that they were ineffective in absolute terms, because otherwise probably they would have at that point simply run away without even deploying. But they weren't probably at the best of their organization. And you know that the Spartans were, as we were saying before, were quite they were the most advanced Greek army under this point of view. They knew perfectly how to line up quicker than the others. They trained and trained all their lives, so that's all really where their strength really came from. It wasn't because they did things that were so different from what the other Greeks did in tactical terms. It's just that they knew how to do it better and more orderly and more speedily. So here at this point they were capable at least of lining up and to meet the enemy opposing a fight. So here the Persians charge, and it says that the Scythe-Chariots charged and scattered the compact mass. This is quite interesting because it doesn't mean then the phrase is not ended, but then it's another it's a subsequent phase. But here it's interesting that it simply mentions the Scythe-Chariots charged and scattered the compact mass. So here it's not really talking about the rest of the cavalry. And it is very interesting because you have to think of the numbers here. Here are just 2 Scythe-Chariots. They're not like 10. That would have been obviously something greater. We're talking about 2 Scythe-Chariots fighting against, here it says, the compact mass of 700 men. Here it says charged and scattered the compact mass. So obviously, as we were saying before, we don't know how really compact this mass really was. My suggestion is that for this compact mass to be scattered, probably for being scattered by 2 Scythe-Chariots only, probably this mass wasn't exceedingly compact at this point. But it's still very meaningful that only 2 chariots could break into 700 men. They didn't rout them, they simply scattered the compact mass. So this is a bit like we don't really know what happened. This is my suggestion, but my idea is that the phalanx was not really compact. At least it wasn't from a psychological point of view. They probably were, physically speaking, as individuals, but in their minds they were kind of agitated, anxious, confused, disoriented, and basically these chariots passed through and split up the formation in some way. They could break through in practice. So the usual lines of the Greeks at this point would be, I don't know, probably it was a rank of 100 men in the front, maybe 7 lines. I don't know, I'm just speculating, but roughly this could be the thing. And it's not effectively a pretty huge formation. So 2 big chariots really charging through them I don't know how, we don't know how they were equipped in practice, how heavily. Because, by the way, if you just get out for foraging, probably you're not bringing the whole suit of armor. That, by the way, at this time was already a bit lighter than in the older days among the Greek hoplites. So the idea is that really these massive chariots could really break a gap into their lines. And then it says, and speedily the cavalry had laid low in the dust about 100 men. This is also very interesting because it gives actually a quantity of people that were slain by the cavalry. It sounds like basically the cavalry was really all was at least very close to the Scythe-Chariots in practice. Here it doesn't say the chariots were, if they charged multiple times, if they did, we don't know what, because if my idea is that if these chariots had just passed around these troops, assuming that they could, because of the given the terrain, which we don't know in fact, they would have just knocked out maybe some guy into the edge of the formation, but my idea is that they really pierced through, and then the other cavalry entered into these gaps and threw javelins at close range, harassed these guys. We don't know also whether the phalanx was flanked or not. Here it doesn't say that. As we were saying, 700 men is not a huge quantity, so even the dimension of this formation in an open, flat ground might have allowed the enemy to surround them, to outflank them in some way, and that was usually the moment into which the phalanx collapsed, because the phalanx is perfect in the front for meeting attacks in the front, but if it's surrounded, it breaks, and this is how it really happens for every kind of formation in the ancient world. Maybe you can turn and try to fight, but the whole thing is messed up, and in fact usually ancient armies try to find covered flanks in the battlefield in their deployment in some fashion. But here it really sounds like eventually the phalanx melted away. And here it says, and 100 men over 700 killed is actually pretty high. And also considering that these hoplites were probably still decently equipped in order to, for a hand-to-hand fight. So it's a very high rate of mortality. And it says then, while the rest of the hoplites retreated hastily. So basically of this 700, 600, 100 were killed and the other 600 fled. And they fled, and then the paragraph finishes, under cover of Agesilaus and his hoplites, who were fortunately near. So this is interesting because here we don't know how Agesilaus was really close. Probably he had lined up knowing that the Persians were arriving. Surely there were horse messengers that could run to the camp, to the settlement where they were, and Agesilaus probably lined up his hoplites with a better order than the foraging guys that had just mustered hastily together, and arriving into their support. And you know also that hoplites weren't that mobile in practice as long as they remained in formation, and even their equipment wasn't really made up for mobility and running, let's say. It was crucial at this point that at least these hoplites arrived, and seemingly they solved the situation, because here it doesn't says and the battle was over. It just passes to other military operations. So it's implicit in here that the Persians basically retreated. I mean, there was no further clash, if not some skirmishes or stuff like that. It's also interesting that the fleeing hoplites were running under cover of the other hoplites. So meaning that at least the Agesilaus hoplites, hoplite phalanx, was at this point able to even to absorb the eventual attack of the rest of cavalry. Cavalry at this time, I didn't say that, but I hinted at it while saying about the decline of war chariots. At this time, cavalry wasn't able to defeat really infantry alone, if not with combined tactics like the ones of the steppes, but normally these hoplitic formations were kind of the toughest infantries that existed in the world, so and cavalry couldn't break them practically. There is also mass that was used in the sense that in order to make to have a solid phalanx, you have to deploy several hundred men at least, definitely something more. So it's not something that the Persians didn't have such a heavy cavalry to break through these lines. They had the chariots, the sheeted chariots that we know that even against more, let's say, more effective phalanxes like the Macedonian one that eventually met up that destroyed the Achaemenid army several times. The Persians still thought that they could break into that with chariots, and if they thought so, it's not because they were stupid at all, but it is because practically it was still feasible to break into them. But generally speaking, this really didn't happen. So the fact that it didn't, I mean, it didn't happen often at least, and this is probably one of the few few examples that we have that is, however, very particular of cavalry breaking into infantry frontally. These things were used mostly to harass and maybe to try to open a gaps on a very particular weak area of the enemy line, to eventually let other troops finishing the job, like it happened here, because the chariots opened a gap, and then seemingly the cavalry exploited that. So the advancing hoplites of Agesilaus seemingly were able to contain the rest of, I mean, the Persian entirely mounted, seemingly contingent. So this was basically the Battle of Daskylion. Personally, I mean, there is someone who basically you know, it's interesting because certain people use this battle like saying, oh, you see, the eventually the Scythe-Chariots were kind of designed to break into a phalanx, and a Greek phalanx in this case. I think it's a too mechanicistic answer. I mean, it's obvious that a Scythe-Chariot has the objective of breaking up a formation. Chariots were sent even against horses. I mean, that's an effect that they're gonna have anyway against anyone. And saying that this was designed practically to break the Greek hoplitic phalanx, or that this was, in this sense, a clash that can be interpreted in this way as a general lesson, as a general rule, I think it's pretty silly, because from one side we know that it didn't happen practically in other times, or if it happened on a smaller scale or in certain engagements that we don't know, it seemingly didn't happen into other major engagements, or at least it wasn't the way the Persians were able to defeat a Greek army, a phalanx of that kind. And that's the reason why they used other troops as well, other arms, and I think we have to reason in a less dogmatic way in this sense. Here, if you were the Persian commander Pharnabazus, with such a weird name, but I'm sure etymologically speaking it's very resounding. You have these enemies that are mustering quite you know, hastily and in a probably disorderly fashion, or at least not at the best of their arrangement. You need really to capitalize upon that disorder. What do? You just throw the heaviest force that you have, the two Scythe-Chariots, and that's it. And you add up with the support of other cavalry. So you break the resistance of these guys, so they break and simply go away. And that's it, I believe. And yet I think it's very didactic in many ways as a battle, because it practically shows how in lack of order it really takes a very few, like 2 chariots against 700 men, to actually break up the formation. Because probably these guys had, even if they had remained 700 in number, but they had marched in a more orderly fashion, with more calm, with a proper equipment and proper internal disposition, they probably would have not been broken. They might have risked, they might have suffered casualties, but I don't think that they would have been so easy to defeat. So this is actually a very good lesson that shows how there is this kind of critical mass that if it doesn't exist in physical terms as well as psychological ones, you know, the whole body really lost cohesion, and you can defeat him. And this happened really many times in history. Order is everything. Order is everything. And these were the Spartans, so the guys in Greece that had the best ordered phalanx. So it's very meaningful, and it's actually a very interesting battle to know, the Battle of Daskylion. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel to receive news about my my new videos. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.